Hey guys, what's going on? Dean Meadows for the Daily Apologist. It is Free for All Friday. This is the section of our video series where we kind of separate ourselves from the study that takes place on Monday and Tuesday. And I just talk about and we just kind of go over some things that maybe I've seen out there on the web, maybe seen on YouTube, or maybe talk about a conversation or multiple conversations that I've had this week with some skeptics or Christians or just people in general. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about is something I've actually done a three-part series on as far as the blogs are concerned, is a recent video done by someone who I would consider a friend, but at worst maybe an acquaintance, by a guy by the name of PineCreek. His actual name is Doug. A while back, he did a video series called 10 Questions Apologists and Pastors Don't Like. And so he goes through these 10 questions that are thought-provoking questions, definitely. And supposedly apologists and preachers don't like these questions because they're uncomfortable and they're highly emotional as well. However, emotional or uncomfortable they might be, these questions have to be answered. They have to be addressed. And to Doug's credit, they definitely are good questions. But that doesn't mean that there aren't good answers to them as well. And so for the next however much time we have together, I want to look at these 10 questions and talk about these 10 questions. And so the first question is there anything your God has done in the past that makes you uncomfortable? Yes, there are things that God has done in the past that, as a human being, that I am initially emotionally either uncomfortable with, or I might not completely and totally understand. There are definitely things in the Bible that are talked about that we don't necessarily have answers to, events specifically that we might not have the answers to. However, when I reflect upon each of these situations, I think about the nature of God. I think about the fact that He is just, the fact that He is loving, the fact that He is all-knowing. And so when I look at something like the flood, or I look at something like the killing of the Canaanites that comes to mind, while I might be initially uncomfortable with those things, I look at these things and I note that they're justified on the basis of really three things. One is the sin of the people, two is the righteousness of God, and three is the foreknowledge of God. That the people who were part of these circumstances and situations, the text makes it clear that they were unjust. Two, the Bible clearly says that God is just. And three, the fact that God, in His foreknowledge, knows things that I don't know, and so I trust Him in those moments and in those situations and those circumstances. So that's the answer to number one. Number two, what are your doubts about A, the truth of Christianity, and B, if your God is real? I think to some degree we all go through this state or states of doubt with regards to the truth of Christianity. I've wrestled with these questions about the truth of Christianity, about whether or not God exists or is real. I've looked at some of the textual objections to Scripture. Look at the objections to whether or not a God, not necessarily the Christian God, but if a God at all even exists. And probably the biggest objection that most people have to the second one about God's existence is the the idea of, if God is all good and God is, all just, then why is there evil, pain, and suffering? But regardless of these doubts that I have that might stem from some of these questions, they have to be taken in totality of the background information, right? So the information which would be included would be something like, it would be included but not necessarily limited to, like the case for the resurrection, the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument from consciousness, the moral argument, the argument from the design of the universe. And so whatever doubts that I may or may not have, they're offset by the totality of the cumulative case for not just the existence of a God, but the existence of the God of Christianity, and that Christianity is true. And so I think that no matter what doubts that I might have, that are valid, that are legitimate doubts, I also believe that I have sufficient reasonable answers for those doubts as well. So that's number two. Number three, what would your life look like if you left Christianity? What's the worst that can happen if one leaves your religion? So I don't specifically know what life would look like. I'm sure that there would be pain and this is, yes, some pain and sorrow on the part of people who deeply care about me living, who deeply care about me leaving Christianity. I'm sure that that's part of it. But ultimately, I would be rejecting a relationship with the sovereign creator of the universe. And so I would be leaving, the joy of worship, the joy of the Christian community, the loss of eternity with God, and receiving eternal separation and condemnation from Him in hell. That's what would happen. That's the worst thing that could happen if someone leaves Christianity. But as far as what life would look like if I left Christianity, it's hard for me to say because I haven't left Christianity. So I don't know that I could give a complete robust of what that would look like. Maybe it would involve some pain. Maybe it would involve some rejection. Maybe life would go on as normal. Maybe I would become a bad person, right? A worse person. Maybe I wouldn't. So that's a hard question to answer because you can only really, I think you could probably only know that on if you actually left Christianity. So number 4, could you role play as an Orthodox Jew and explain a couple of the prophecies for me from their perspective? So probably the biggest section of prophecy containing messianic language would be Isaiah 53. So for the sake of time and space, we'll concentrate on that. The text contains many references to a suffering servant who would come along and die for the iniquity of God's people. So role-playing a Jewish apologist, I'd say the following. Number 1, the immediate context must be describing Israel because the greater narrative is about Israel during the time of captivity. Furthermore, as I even look to the disciples of Jesus, they didn't even think that he was that type of suffering servant because in Matthew 16:16, upon learning that Jesus would be killed, Peter states, God forbid it. That's never going to happen. Jesus himself didn't see him as this messianic person either because he asked in the garden, hey, let this cup pass from me. And so if the immediate context is about Israel and Jesus' own disciples and Jesus himself didn't see him as this messianic suffering servant, why in the world should I see him as that suffering servant? So now, outside of the role play, that might seem convincing. However, when we actually look at the book of Isaiah, it certainly was written to Israel, but there's no way that Isaiah 53 is about the nation of Israel. They weren't going to suffer iniquity to save themselves. They were in the position they were in because of their iniquity. So on the basis of all of Isaiah 53, when it talks about the purity, the speech, the nature of the sacrifice for sin, this certainly wouldn't apply to the nation of Israel because, or the people of Israel, because even in the New Testament time, in the first century, what do we see through secular history and even biblical, the biblical accounts, is that the Jewish people were not looking for the nation to do A, B, C, or D. They were looking for a person who would come in and kick out the Romans. They were looking for that one specific person that would do this physical act, in kicking out the Romans and return Israel to the glory days of David. So this is probably a good reason for the explanation of Peter's shock when Jesus says that he will die, because if he's the Messiah and he's supposed to do all these things, he can't depose the Romans while he's dead, right? So furthermore, Jesus clearly views himself as the Messiah and divine through Scripture. His emotional state in the garden is understandable because of what he was about to endure from that human perspective. So it doesn't necessarily follow that from his emotional response that he didn't view himself as messianic in nature. So that's the answer to number 4. Number 5, could you role play a skeptic or atheist and explain why 500 witnesses to a risen Jesus or woman finding an empty tomb is not convincing to them? So role-playing as an atheist or a skeptic, I'd say that these 500 witnesses are not specifically named in 1 Corinthians 15. Therefore, how could you know that they're reliable regarding the appearances of Jesus? Secondly, who's to say that the women didn't go to a wrong tomb thinking that it was Jesus' tomb and believing him to be resurrected? I mean, on these grounds, as an atheist or a skeptic, it doesn't seem that those two supposed facts would be convincing. Now, these seem, stepping outside of the role play, these seem like good answers, right, for the 500 witnesses and for the women finding the tomb. But the question is, are they? And I don't think so. With regards to the 500 witnesses, this is specifically a creed that Paul cites that dates from about 35 to 37 AD, really close to the events of Jesus' death, burial, and reported resurrection. And that's just, according to A. and Shore and White, and what he talks about as far as how long it takes for legend to creep into to history. This is clearly too short of a time for legend to creep into the narrative with regards to Jesus' resurrection. Secondly, secular historians of the time didn't document every single witness to an event, right? Nor do they do so today. For example, Plutarch, who is a biographer who lived from 45 AD to around AD 127, he wrote a multitude of biographies throughout his life. And in one case, he writes about the impeachment of Dolabella, stating upon Julius Caesar's return to Rome that he impeached Dolabella for maladministration of his province. And what's interesting is that Plutarch notes that many from the cities of Greece supplied Caesar with testimony. Now, it doesn't seem, based upon the research that I've done, it doesn't seem that anybody questions whether or not Dolabella was, relieved of his duty of maladministration on the basis of his inability to govern his province. So it doesn't seem that anybody questions that. So what's interesting here is that Plutarch says we've got this testimony from many people from the cities of the Greeks who testified against this guy. Now, I've never heard someone say that this isn't a historical event because it doesn't mention the names of the cities, representatives who showed up, or those who wrote written complaints against Dolabella. So it seems that this is a historical account, but we don't have specifically all of the witnesses that testified against this guy. But I don't know of anybody who would say that that's not historical. So if that's going to apply in the case of Dolabella, that, yeah, this is historical even though we don't have all the witnesses, why wouldn't that also be the case for something that's documented within a 3-year span of the event that simply notes 500 witnesses saw Jesus, saw the risen Jesus? I think if you're going to apply the standard to one piece of history, you would also have to apply that standard to this creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, regarding the appearances, regarding the women going to the wrong tomb, all 4 Gospels record that Joseph of Arimathea, who is a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, buried Jesus in a family tomb that he owned, and he was accompanied by a group of women who followed Jesus throughout his ministry. Matthew records that there were Roman guards that were placed at the tomb, which was sealed with a stone and was sealed with the emperor's insignia. And so upon the resurrection report, the guards appealed to the Jewish leaders, who Joseph of Arimathea most likely would have known, for help. In the end, the Jewish leaders promised protection, and they say, if anybody asks, just tell them that, while you were asleep, the disciples came in and stole the body. But here's the thing. This is what we know, based upon the gospel accounts, right? The Jews knew where the tomb was. The women who accompanied Joseph of Arimathea, who was a Jew, knew where the tomb was, and the Romans knew where the tomb was. So if this wrong tomb deal is correct, then everybody must have had a case of mass amnesia. The women forgot where the tomb was, having just visited it. The Jews who knew Joseph of Arimathea must have forgotten where it was, and the Romans must have forgotten where it was. So, if the price for getting rid of the resurrection is believing that 3 separate groups, all who knew where the tomb was, had mass amnesia, if that's the price that the skeptic wants to pay for explaining away the empty tomb and the resurrection, then I'll be more than happy to let them pay that price. So, number 6, why is sin bad? Why is disappointing your God bad? So, sin is bad because, hey, it violates the relationship between the Creator and the created. In the same way that a parent feels when a child violates their relationship by doing wrong, right? So sin's bad because it often leads to unforeseen negative consequences in our own lives and the lives of others, right? And disappointing God is bad because He's a God of love, and He's a God of mercy, and He's a God of compassion. And just as any well-meaning parent wants what's best for their kid, God wants what's best for us. And so, as a father, I would be emotionally devastated if my kids intentionally wanted to disappoint me, to do wrong towards me, and to reject me. And I believe that that's the same thing, with regards to God. And so I'd hope it would be emotionally disappointing for you who are parents that are out there. And so just because I might disappoint God and reject God, just as my kids might disappoint me and reject me, it still doesn't mean that I love them less, and it still doesn't mean that God doesn't still desire and want those who are not a part of His family to be a part of His family, or those who have left His family to come back. So that's why sin's bad, and that's why disappointing God is bad as well. So that's number 6. So for 7 and 8, I'm going to go ahead and group these together because I think that they are under the same general umbrella. And it says, if God commanded you to kill your loved one, would you do it? And if God brought the utmost suffering to the world for 3 hours, would that be good? So for number 7, kind of goes back to what we said before. Given that God's nature is one of love and justice, if he commanded such a thing, because he is love and he is just, he would have a just reason for it, and therefore I would be obligated to do it. So in knowing that it was definitely 100%, the God of the Bible, I would kill a loved one if he commanded it. But I want to caveat that because this scenario doesn't seem to be realistic in light of the book of Hebrews, as the author notes that the death, sacrifice, killing of Jesus was the death, the sacrifice, and the killing for all time and for all people. So this number 7 seems just to be an appeal to emotion of the most extreme. But given the question and given the nature of God, the answer to that question would be yes. With regards to number 8, if God brought the utmost suffering to the world for 3 hours, would that be good? Once again, I think that Doug here, or PineCreek, is trying to place our initial intuition that suffering is bad. He's trying to place that against a hypothetical choice that God would make. So by doing this, it seems that Doug wants to impugn God's morality because such a choice would be driven against our intuition regarding suffering and love, or it seems that way, right? However, if this hypothetical were actually to happen, then we would first have to take a look at the nature of God, which we've kind of talked about, and suffering in the Bible in order to answer this question, because we're operating from the Christian worldview. And so what we see when we look at the Bible is that there are times when God allows suffering in order to bring about a person's salvation, or to steer them back to him, or even to allow his kingdom to expand. I think about Acts chapter 8, where the church grew and the church spread into Judea and Samaria to the ends of the world, not because everybody was interlocking arms and singing Kumbaya, but because there was a persecution that happened against the church. I think about Paul, who was struck blind, and that resulted in his salvation. So we see also that the nature of God is one, as I said before, of love and justice. And so from these facts, what we can do is we can conclude that if God were to allow this type of suffering, the utmost suffering for 3 hours, his nature dictates that he would have good reason for allowing it. So in this case, suffering would be a good thing. For instance, the number one case of the utmost suffering for 3 hours would be that of the pain and agony that Jesus underwent while on the cross. And what came from it? Salvation for Christians, the final payment for sin, and the exaltation of Jesus at the right hand of God upon his resurrection and ascension. So that's number 8. Number 9, how do you tell the difference between having a personal relationship with your God and just thinking you do and are mistaken? So often emotions drive the answer to this question. Often the answer is, well, because I feel it, right? And not saying that emotions aren't a part of a relationship with Jesus. They certainly are. However, the question of how can I know is a little bit different than how I feel. Like I could very well feel one way and be completely and totally misguided. And so we know that we have a personal relationship with God and aren't mistaken when our feelings or our feelings match, what we read in the text of the Bible as Christians. If we believe that it's a divinely inspired text, that it's historically reliable, then we can understand that however the Bible outlines a personal relationship with Jesus, that is that is how we know that we have a personal relationship and that we're not mistaken. So this question really comes down to what does the Bible say and how reliable is the Bible? So right here, real quick, shameless plug. If you haven't been listening to the podcast here recently for like the last 2 weeks, we're actually I'm doing a series right now with regards to that. Also over on the Daily Apologist YouTube channel, we're doing that as well. So that's number 9. And so then we come to the last question. What kind of evidence would you need to have to believe that my granddad had a 40-foot tall fire-breathing dragon? This question is funny. I really do enjoy at least the comedy behind this question. So in answering this question, we would simply utilize common historical and archaeological methods that are used to verify historical events or objects in the past. And so I'm not going to run through all of them, but I'll give 4 that would help us know whether Doug's, or if you want to call him PineCreeks, granddad had a 40-foot tall fire-breathing dragon. 1, what's the name of PineCreek's grandfather? When was he born? When did he die? That way we can match some of these other questions up. Is there any record of him purchasing, capturing, being given a dragon, or acquiring a dragon in any way, shape, or form? And maybe the more important question, even before that question, is there any record archaeologically, historically, that dragons ever existed? And if they did exist, did they live in the time and place where PineCreek's granddad lived? So there's another question. Was anyone ever burned by PineCreek's granddad's dragon? Or did anyone ever encounter that dragon in any other way? And here's 5, one I just thought of. Is there any record that would mutually attest to the in regarding to the length of the dragon? So I said it was 4, but I thought of the 5th one. So these are just 5 basic things that we could look at in a way to verify historically and archaeologically if PineCreek's granddad had a 40-foot tall fire-breathing dragon. Now, this is designed to poke a hole in the reliability of the New Testament. However, check out the podcast, check out the videos. I would suggest getting Craig Blomberg's book, Historical Reliability of the New Testament. More than enough evidence to support the claims of the New Testament, and more specifically, what we're doing right now, the Gospels. So, while these 10 questions are challenging, perhaps even devastating for the unsuspecting Christian, they're neither unanswerable nor are they anything for the Christian to fear. So thank you once again for tuning in. Thank you once again for listening in. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and God bless. And on behalf of the Daily Apologist team, equip yourself to engage culture. Have a great day. God bless.